As we move through Proverbs 28, we discover a true map of wisdom encompassing our relationship with God, the shaping of character, the pursuit of insight, family, and social ties, the use of our resources, just leadership, and the consequences of our decisions. As we delve into these teachings, we see how they intertwine with the grand biblical narrative in everyday life. Each principle remains relevant and encourages us to reflect on who we are and where we are headed. 1. Spiritual foundations. At the beginning of our journey, we find the basis of everything in verse 13, which reads, "He who covers his sins will not prosper, but whoever confesses and forsakes them will have mercy." It's like someone trying to hide a wound under their clothing, hoping it will vanish on its own. Eventually, the infection becomes apparent, and only by uncovering and treating it carefully can it truly heal. This teaching reminds us of King Giv'el when he committed a serious sin with Bathsheba, 2 Samuel 11-12. He tried to hide his wrongdoing, lied, and even orchestrated Uriah's death. Yet he found no peace until the prophet Nathan confronted him, leading him to acknowledge his sin and pen that moving Psalm 51, in which he cries out for divine mercy. Today, in a similar way, we are urged not to conceal our failures, but to confess and turn away from them to receive God's forgiveness. Or as 1 John 1:9 says, "He is faithful to forgive if we confess." A bit further on, verse 14 presents the person who always fears the Lord, calling them blessed. But this isn't about a paralyzing fear. Rather, it's a deep respect that creates a before and after in the way we live. Like Joseph in Genesis 39, who fled temptation when his master's wife tried to seduce him, that reverence for God kept him from falling into sin and suffering devastating consequences. The fear of God is an anchor that steadies us against strong winds in our everyday lives. Finally, still on the topic of foundations, verse 9 says, "One who turns away his ear from hearing the law, even his prayer, is an abomination." It's as if someone covers their ears and then expects to be heard. How can we anticipate God's attention to our prayers if we refuse to listen to his word? Saul, in 1 Samuel 15, exemplifies this well. He disobeyed the Lord's orders and then sought the divine blessing. The result was his rejection. This passage pushes us to maintain an attitude that listens, receives, and obeys, for otherwise our prayers lose power. A solid foundation is built when we humbly acknowledge our need for God's guidance. 2. Personal character. Now imagine a man burdened by guilt. He's restless, glances over his shoulder, and flees even when no one is pursuing him. That's how verse 1 depicts those who act wickedly, in contrast to the righteous who stand bold like a lion. The story of Cain, Genesis 4, illustrates this. After killing his brother, he was so haunted by fear that he never found rest. Meanwhile, the just sleep peacefully, like someone switching off the light at day's end, knowing everything is in order. Continuing with character formation, verse 26 warns, "He who trusts in his own heart is a fool." While following your heart may sound nice, Scripture reminds us that the heart is deceitful. Jeremiah 17:9. Samson, Judges 16, is a perfect example of someone relying on himself and his own strength until those very passions left him blind and captive. Wisdom therefore calls us to seek God's guidance and the counsel of the wise, recognizing that we often fail to see all the implications of our choices. When we consider attitudes that hinder relationships, verse 25 states, "He who is of a proud heart stirs up strife, but he who trusts in the Lord will be prospered." Nabal, the man who disdained the future King David, 1 Samuel 25. nearly brought disaster upon his household because of his arrogance. History shows us that pride erects walls and sparks conflict, whereas trust in God opens doors to reconciliation and genuine prosperity. Lastly, we wrap up this section with verse 18, which affirms, "Whoever walks blamelessly will be saved." We see this integrity in the prophet Daniel chapter 1, who refused to defile himself with the king's food and was honored and protected in a foreign land, even surviving the lion's den. This account spurs us to value the consistency between our beliefs and our actions, reminding us that a solid testimony does not go unnoticed and can influence even the most powerful. 3. Wisdom and discernment. Proverbs 28:5 states that the wicked do not understand justice, but those who seek God understand all. It's as though sin blinds them, placing divine justice out of reach. The Pharisees, for instance, failed to recognize Jesus' work, John 9:39-41, because of their hard hearts. By contrast, those who approach God do so with humility, receiving light to see clearly. Hence, wisdom depends not only on intellect, but on a sincere willingness to learn. In verse 7, we find a very practical idea. Whoever keeps the law is a discerning son. Timothy, a young man steeped in scripture from childhood, 2 Timothy 3:15, was able to face opposition and temptation, thus demonstrating his discernment. And we're reminded that genuine wisdom is evident in our behavior, not merely in what we claim to know. Every choice we make shows whether we've truly internalized God's principles or merely uphold them superficially. Meanwhile, verse 11 presents the reality of many wealthy individuals who consider themselves wise in their own eyes, while an understanding poor man sees life more objectively. One might recall the rich young ruler of Matthew 19:16-22, so attached to his possessions that he couldn't let them go to follow Jesus. This teaches us that genuine wisdom doesn't hinge on how much we own, but on our willingness to submit to God's guidance. Sometimes our achievements or material goods become walls that block our view of what really matters. 4. Family and social relationships. As we delve into this topic, verse 24 stands out. Whoever robs his father or his mother and says, "It is no transgression." This highlights how seriously the Bible regards honor toward parents. In Jesus' time, some religious leaders, Mark 7:9-13, avoided supporting their parents by declaring their possessions dedicated to the temple. In God's eyes, this was an absurd excuse, masking a profound lack of piety. Next, verse 23 shows that correcting someone who is in the wrong, though challenging, can yield benefits over time. He who rebukes a man will find more favor afterward. Nathan, the prophet who confronted King David about his sin, is a remarkable example. In Samuel 12. Though painful at first, sincere reproof ultimately earns gratitude when it seeks the other person's well-being. Lastly, verse 10 cautions, "Whoever causes the upright to go astray in an evil way, he himself will fall into his own pit." We think of Haman, the enemy of the Jewish people in the book of Esther, who built a gallows for Mordecai and ended up hanged on it himself, Esther 7:9-10. Deceiving or diverting someone from the righteous path means setting a trap that will sooner or later ensnare the deceiver. These relationships remind us that we don't live in isolation. The harm we inflict on others doesn't just affect them, it eventually comes back to us as well. 5. Managing wealth, verse 6, hits the mark. Better is the poor who walks in his integrity than one perverse in his ways, though he be rich. The prophet Elijah, for example, lived with very little but under divine protection, while King Ahab had great wealth tainted by injustice. 1 Kings 16 to 18. It's a straightforward lesson. Honesty isn't for sale at any price. Often, the temptation to deceive will crush our conscience and bring bitterness, even though the world may applaud apparent prosperity. Also, verse 8 admonishes those who increase their riches by usury, people who get rich by exploiting others. Consider Zacchaeus, a tax collector who profited unjustly. Luke 19, 1-10. However, when he met Jesus, he recognized his wrongdoing and decided to repay what he had taken. This shows there's always a path back to integrity, even if our decisions have harmed others. Verse 19 underscores the importance of tending one's own field, not just in agriculture, but any honest, persistent work that puts food on the table. Like the Apostle Paul, who made tents so as not to be a burden to anyone. Acts chapter 18, 1-3. Diligent labor is a blessing that ultimately bears fruit, helping us develop a sense of responsibility and contribution to both personal well-being and society at large. However, verse 20, and again in verse 22, warns, "A man with an evil eye hastens after riches and does not consider that poverty will come upon him." Gehazi, Elisha's servant, experienced this personally. 2 Kings 5:20-27. Driven by greed, he lied to obtain wealth and ended up leprous. This teaches us to value God's daily provision and resist the temptation of harmful shortcuts. Those who chase riches at any cost often sacrifice their peace, relationships, or even their health. Finally, verse 27 claims, "He who gives to the poor will not lack." Offering a meal to someone in need or providing warmth to those who are cold are actions that God highly esteems. The widow of Zarephath, 1 Kings 17, 10-16, shared her last provisions with the prophet Elijah and witnessed how her flour and oil never ran out. Giving in God's kingdom brings blessing and multiplies gratitude, reminding us that true wealth is reflected in our generosity and in the positive impact we leave on others. 6. Leadership and government. In verse 2, we learn that because of the transgression of a land, many are its princes. In other words, when society strays from divine principles, corruption thrives and leadership changes abound without clear direction. The book of Judges faithfully portrays this. Judges 21:25. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes, leading to oppressive rulers and widespread chaos. Without a justice-based compass, multiple voices rise, each claiming its own truth. Verse 15 compares a wicked ruler to a roaring lion and a charging bear. Think of the Pharaoh who enslaved the Israelites, Exodus 1, or King Herod, who killed children in search of Jesus, Matthew chapter 2. They epitomize cruel, ruthless power that makes their people tremble and live in constant fear. Verse 16 highlights that a ruler who lacks understanding will oppress more. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, exemplifies this. 1 Kings 12. He ignored the advice of elders, tightened the people's burden, and split the kingdom in two. A leader without wisdom breeds division and suffering, lacking empathy and foresight. Likewise, verse 3 says, "A poor man who oppresses the poor is like a driving rain, which leaves no food." This tragic image depicts someone who, having once known need, gains power and becomes a worse tyrant than someone who was always wealthy. The servant in the parable, Matthew chapter 18, 23-35, was forgiven a huge debt, yet failed to forgive his fellow servant, revealing how far one can fall when the heart hardens and forgets compassion. 7. Final consequences. Proverbs 28 concludes by underscoring the outcomes of each path. Verse 12 states, "When the righteous rejoice, there is great glory." We can practically picture a people celebrating the victory of honesty and uprightness. Joshua and the Israelites experienced that joy when they crossed the Jordan and dedicated the promised land to God. Joshua 4. Portraying the hope that arises when justice governs and God is honored in decisions. On the opposite side, verse 28 shows that when the wicked arise, men hide themselves. Fear and oppression take over. People seek shelter just as they did in Gideon's time, Judges 6, when the Israelites hid in caves to escape the Midianites. Societies steeped in corruption and abuse strip their citizens of peaceful living. Verse 17 warns about the person guilty of bloodshed who will flee to the pit. Cain became a tormented wanderer, Genesis 4, because his brother's blood cried out from the ground. Eventually, guilt catches up with those who act violently, haunting their conscience. Lastly, verse 21 teaches that to show partiality is not good. Justice cannot favor someone based on their status or wealth. James 2, 1-4 is blunt in condemning favoritism toward the rich, reminding us that God shows no partiality. Acts 10:34. In a world so prone to appearances and catering to the powerful, this lesson becomes especially relevant, challenging us to treat everyone equitably. Reaching the end of our journey through Proverbs 28, we see that life is grounded in firm spiritual principles, solid character, and authentic wisdom shown in our relationships, our stewardship of resources, and our leadership. Such values greatly influence our destiny and surroundings, from the family unit to society at large. We also confirm that these principles remain as pertinent now as they ever were. Putting them into practice leads us to a fulfilled life and to more just and caring communities. If this message has blessed you, we encourage you to share it and subscribe to our YouTube channel, where you will find more reflections and teachings to strengthen your faith and your walk with God.